Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Katie Delmay, and I am the curator who had the pleasure of organizing the exhibition Vadis Turner, Tempest, which is on view for 3 more days here in our Gordon Contemporary Artist Project Gallery. Getting to know Turner over the last couple of years has been a very rich and rewarding process. Of course, it has also been wonderful to have the work of an artist who was born and raised right here in Nashville on view this summer. And we are delighted to have her speak about her practice tonight. As you will hear more soon, Turner is a feminist who transforms commonplace materials often associated with women, such as ribbons and quilts, into multi-layered assemblages that are meant to bestow value on female experiences and handiwork. These works, which she does call paintings because the strips of cloth stand in for paint and brushstrokes, also challenge traditional gender roles. And as she said to me once during a planning conversation, they reveal the underbelly of the female archetype. Tempest is Turner's first solo museum exhibition, but I am confident it won't be her last. She is a rising star in the art world who was awarded a very prestigious Joan Mitchell Foundation grant in 2016, and her paintings and sculptures have been featured recently at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Portland, Maine, the Equity Gallery in New York City, Eric Firestone Gallery in East Hampton, New York, the 808 Gallery in Boston, and the Hudgens Center for the Arts in Atlanta. It will be the subject of a solo exposer show at the Art Fair in Chicago next week, which I am very much looking forward to seeing. Turner's art is in the permanent collection of the Brooklyn Museum, the Kentucky Arts and Crafts Museum in Louisville, the Tennessee State Museum, and the 21 museum hotels. In fact, is your work still on view there now in our own 21C? It is. Oh, great. She has been a lecturer in the art department at Vanderbilt University and was in the inaugural class of the Metro Arts Commission's Learning Lab. She has also been featured in an impressive array of press, from the Nashville scene to the New York Times. Turner returned to her hometown in 2014 after receiving a BFA and MFA from Boston University, and then living and working in New York for many years. Before I turn the podium over to her, though, I'd like to acknowledge our gratitude to the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their ongoing support of the Frist Center. But now, please join me in welcoming to the stage an artist that Nashville can be very proud to call our own, Vadis Turner.
Thank you. It sounds so much better when you say all of that. I mean, it does sound amazing, but thank you all for coming tonight. I just want to start by giving a humongous thank you to the Frist Center. I mean, this has been such a huge treat to be in the presence of state-of-the-art and ancestral modern. I think everything that's been going on here this summer has created a really special conversation for me and my studio, and I hope for all of you. So can we just give it back to this special place that we're all in and say thank you to the Frist Center. And it's obviously been a dream for me. I mean, this is the dream that we are in right now. I'm sort of pinching myself, but I want to also say thank you to Mark Scala for putting this show on the table and for making it happen, and also to Katie. I think I'm spoiled for life. I'd like to welcome that challenge on working with other museum curators, but you really, our meetings were incredible, and I think you made connections through my wildest tangents and really made sense of them and made beautiful language out of them, and I'm really proud of the show that we made together, so thank you. And I promise after this I'm going to start texting you less on your cell phone. But, and it's been hard knowing that you're cheating on me with somebody else and planning somebody else's show, but at least it's Nick Cave, so I'll take that. It's a pretty big deal, and so the future shows here are fabulous as well. I didn't really talk to you much about what I'm going to talk about tonight, so this is not a gallery talk. We're going full Monty, sort of post-college. I want to share with you sort of my journey and my story about how my work got to be what it is now in this incredible place. So, let's see, have I given all the thanks I need to give? Yeah. All right, let's look at this beautiful slide. I want to start talking about my early work after college, but before that, I want to say that I really wouldn't be an artist if I didn't have one art teacher in Nashville, Tennessee, Rosie Pascal at Harpeth Hall School. Being in her class was a game changer, and I know I wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for her. I was a pretty mediocre student at the time, and she scooped me up and taught me how to make connections between what was going on in my classes at Harpeth Hall and what was going on in the art studio. And she also taught me to have confidence in my ideas and for me to understand that all of my interests are relevant, that they're all important, and that my subject matter is really right under my nose. And that's something I think about a lot. I did mostly painting at Harpeth Hall, and I went on to study painting at Boston University. And I've talked to other artists about this. I can't speak for everybody, but my experience, well, I loved art school. I mean, I kind of love school in general. I loved teaching. I loved being in school, and graduating was kind of a dark day. But I loved the drama of art school. I loved the fiery critiques. I loved all the contradictory advice I got from different professors. And I had a lot of voices in my head when I graduated. And I had a lot of abstract paintings that they weren't terrible, but I didn't really I couldn't find any traces of my own voice or identity in them. And so after leaving college, I decided to just take a little bit of a break from painting. But I knew, and this sounds dramatic, and I think it's true, but I thought if I took a break and didn't make anything, I might actually rust over. And it's always important to take some time off, but not too much. And I came back to Nashville, and I was living in my mom's house. And I wasn't going to paint for a little while, but I wanted to make something. And I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do. But I still had a subscription to some art magazines, and I saw an image by Jessica Stockholder. And it wasn't this image. I couldn't find it. I still have the torn out piece of paper, but I couldn't find it online. And I thought, wow, she's making artwork out of household materials, things from the domestic sphere. She's making sculpture, and it still kind of looks like a painting. And that's something I was going to say earlier. I can't speak for other artists, but when you study something like painting or sculpture or printmaking, you're sort of forever brainwashed to see everything as a painting. I think you all look like a painting, or I think a sculpture looks like a painting. I think that looks like a painting. And so I always saw it with that lens. But looking at her sculpture was really interesting because I learned that I thought, I could make artwork out of anything in the world. And then I was also looking at Leslie Dill and Lisa Yuskavage, or Yuskavage. Does anyone want to correct me on that? I always get it. Yuskavage? I know somebody. Jana? How do you pronounce her last name? Where are you?
I'm right here.
Okay, Yuskavage. All right, I'm sticking with it. So Leslie and Lisa came to speak at Boston University when I was an undergraduate there. And what I took away from that was that a dress could be sort of a vessel for an idea or a structure that I could use. I could play around with to do a lot of things with. And then Lisa Yuskavage, her work is, it's interesting to me for a lot of reasons. I think she's sort of rubberized the female body, and I have this thing that I'll talk about later with cake. But she's definitely playing and exaggerating the female form and certainly sexualizing it, and that's something that I was playing it with in my early mixed media work as well. So, living at home, thinking that I could make artwork out of anything, and since I was living at home, I didn't really have to pay for it. I could just start using things out of my mom's kitchen or out of my mom's bathroom. And I really got busy. The first thing I made was a dress made out of wax paper. I made many dresses out of wax paper, actually, and I don't have a lot of pictures of them, but the earliest work that I would do a photograph of is this kitchen rubber glove dress. Some of the dresses I made were miniature, some were life-size. And living at home, I had I tried to get out of there. I went to school in Boston, as I said, and I was living at home. And as a semi-adult at that time, and being back in Nashville, I had the voices of my professors in my head, but I also revisited the voices of many generations of women who had advised me over the years, from infancy on. Thinking about expectations for women, pathways that women traditionally take, behavior, and expectations. And I was mulling all of this around when I was kind of pulling at different types of kitchen materials in my mom's kitchen. And I made some dresses that were for specific occasions that were appropriate, and some, like the lingerie, that got a little naughty or a little bit inappropriate. So this is the super early mixed media work, and I just want to emphasize that, wax paper was like the gateway drug for me. I mean, it was sort of this game-changing moment where I realized I could make artwork out of anything. I could shop for art materials at thrift stores, grocery stores. I could look in the bottom of my purse or around my car, and I was using pantyhose and curlers and cotton balls and garbage bags, and I was in this wonderful fury of I can just keep using these domestic materials to make sculpture and use them in a way where I'm changing how we perceive the material. I'm changing how we see it, and I'm using it as a vehicle for my ideas in some cases, but also that I can transform the mundane into something precious, or I can take something functional and turn it into a contemporary art object. So I took that notion with me when I moved to New York, and this piece, Bobby Pin Explosion, is from 2006. That's one of the earlier works I made when I moved there. And, some artists have very strategic moves they make when they are charting out this type of career. They will choose very carefully who they show with or where they show, and I did not do it that way. I said yes to everything. I had my first solo show at an ice cream parlor. I did one in a tattoo parlor. The only way I could get to Miami the first time was to install this piece in a motel room on top of a toilet. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you approaching your art career this way, but you learn as you go. It's humbling, and you kind of get over the idea of great exposure pretty quickly. But I'm thankful. I'm thankful for the experiences I had, and I'm sort of thankful that at this moment in my life I get to look at one of my first sculptures on top of a toilet in Miami. But I stuck with this pathway, and it wasn't long before I was working with quilts. This isn't one of my favorite pieces, but when I was preparing for this lecture, it's so relevant to my recent quilt work that I was dabbling and experimenting with them in 2007. So this is an antique quilt, but a cutter quilt. Something was damaged or flawed about it, and I was buying these damaged quilts on eBay. And I would mend them to the best of my ability and then alter them in some way. In this case, it's hard to see, and I must say that the color of this slide really isn't great. This is a much brighter yellow, but it says all you can eat in sort of a camouflaged relief cursive. But, quilts were a really exciting thing for me to discover, and I started to think about a quilt as a concept that, really connected all of my work. It was interesting to me for a lot of reasons, but just that it showcased how a woman could measure her time or how she could measure her skills and her handiwork, but also that it's an artifact of our time, and the symbols used in quilts or the shapes are ways that you can sort of trace back a particular culture from a particular place at a particular time. And I also liked it how, I don't know how to make quilts, right? This skill wasn't passed on to me. And so I loved working with antique quilts, hand-sewn quilts that were made by other women, because it linked me to different generations of women, and it allowed me to sort of reinvent the fate for their work or redirect the fate of these pieces. And a lot of the works that I make and still make, certainly wasn't what these women intended, but if it's a cutter quilt on eBay, I don't think the future for it is very bright. But I also gravitate to these pieces because they're heirlooms, right? They have a nostalgic value as they're passed down from one family or generation to another. They increase in monetary value, but certainly nostalgic value, and that these heirlooms are often in the care of women in every family. And so when I started to feel all this and think about this and look at quilts, I thought, quilts are also something that, they have this value, and not all cultures make quilts, but they do make textiles, and oftentimes textiles are elements in dowries. And it was with this work that I started to think that I should be making my own dowry. So I got married in 2009, and in 2008, I started to make my own dowry. And my goal with that was to make a collection of contemporary heirlooms that were measurements of my worth as a woman and my worth as an artist. But instead of giving this fabulous dowry to my husband's family to secure my place in a marriage, I decided to use it for my own financial and professional gain. So I sort of thought about it like stripping it apart like a stolen car. So I was trading parts of it, selling parts of it, and sort of giving it as many legs as it had. All of the heirlooms or the components of my dowry, they look really different. But one of the first pieces I made for it, where I was thinking a lot about how we value ourselves as women and how women are valued in our culture. And I got my BFA and my MFA diploma, and I cut them up and turned them into beauty wares. So you see the eyelashes, and then a retainer with the Boston University insignia on it. So you can see fine arts there. So fake eyelashes, a retainer, and then I put all of the beauty wares into an installation on an actual vanity. So the piece is called Vanity, My Beautiful Education. It's from 2008. And I don't really have a bigger picture of it, so this is obviously a detail, but this was part of my dowry. So this is the installation reception that I made at the end of my dowry project. While I was living in New York up until 2009, really with this piece, I was making primarily sculpture and installation. I mean, the quilt piece being a wall-based piece, but I was making installation in 3D works. And I still was thinking about everything as a painting, although I wasn't making paintings. In this work, something that I wanted to happen is that I wanted to combine the marital bed and the reception from the wedding, and I wanted to introduce elements that made it feel like a young girl's fantasy, but I also wanted it to start feeling like a melting, wilting wedding cake. And when things started to sort of droop and drip with the material and in my imagination and how I arranged it, something about a melting wedding cake started to feel like painting again, in a small way. But that was a really important kind of moment for me in making this work, knowing that I wanted to go back to that somehow, some way. This is a detail from reception, and I tried to create many, many small worlds and landscapes within the piece. And then the piece was acquired by the Brooklyn Museum, and this is a terrible picture of it. I'm sorry not to do it justice, but this is the piece in the Brooklyn Museum, where it lives now. So I wanted to get back to painting, but I didn't really know how, as I was saying, because I didn't want to abandon this sort of feminist palette that I had been working with for about 9 years. And I realized that, life's short, and if you're not honest about the work you want to make, you're sort of wasting your time, right? And the challenge became for me to make paintings out of the materials that I had been making sculptures and installation with, and to try and translate those materials into brush marks and stains and color fields, and to try and re-engage with the wall. So to do that, I looked at a lot of artists who make paintings, or what I consider to be paintings, out of unconventional materials. So this first one is Anna Bethbees, and she makes these gorgeous paintings out of wool rugs, and she dyes them, and she burns them, and she cuts them. And then we have Ellen Atsui, who makes large-scale, incredible mixed media paintings out of bottle caps and different metal piecings. And what I especially love about his work is that it sort of transcends any medium. It's a mixed media piece, it's a painting, it's a sculpture, it's an installation. And they all make me want to drool, but I really love things in art and in life that are hard to classify. Things that occupy some sort of space in between. You don't know what to do with them. You don't know if this is a rug, if it's a painting, if this is a sculpture or an installation or what. And I really respond to artwork that I just don't know what folder to put it in. And I feel that way about people too, and film and music even. It's a broad way to describe sort of what I'm drawn to. And I really aspire to make my work that way as well. So let's see, this is 2010. I don't know that I would call this one a textile painting yet, but it was really an important moment in me getting there. I just finished the dowry project, and I was thinking, what happens to this bride now? What do I do with her, and what's my next step here? So I started to think about this bride being sort of claimed and in a relationship, and wondering, does she become domesticated? Does she enter this domestic life? And I didn't resolve that answer exactly, but I started to think about domestication, which led me to partner the bride with champion horses and prize pigs, and thinking about how we celebrate or honor animal's moment when it's at sort of the peak of its potential or performative capability, and what sort of adornments do we use to communicate that they're at that place. So in the case of a champion horse, I wasn't even familiar with it before, but a derby blanket is what you bedeck the winning horse with. So it's this gorgeous piece made entirely out of flowers, and then prize pigs, the fair is coming up, ribbons. So that's what started to happen in this work, which is called Best in Show. So it's when a woman merges with prize pig, prize horse, and I made a derby blanket that's entirely composed of hand-sewn flowers that are made from upcycled textiles. So lots of clothing, nightgowns, quilts, bedding, things like this. And then also the pig is in there as well. So it's really these sort of domesticated prize animals at the height of their potential. And this was really the first piece where the work started to meet the wall. And I was like, let's take it to the next step. So I thought about the wedding cake in that reception piece that was starting to wilt and starting to melt. And I thought, all right, how do I make these into paintings? And so in my imagination, not in my studio, which is not a good idea, nor is it legal, I lit the cake on fire and I threw it against the wall. And I thought, all right, this is how I'm going to get these compositions generated. So this piece is called Scorched. It's from 2010, and this was really the product of that imagining. But what was really exciting is that this is also on a bed of flowers like derby blanket is, but these ribbons start to become brush marks. And I started to get really, really excited, and I continued to try in this vein. So this is also the wedding cake, but this is me introducing mold to the wedding cake. So what happens when you leave it out and it starts to ruin? And I love, like I said, these unclassifiable moments, but I want the work to sort of hover somewhere in between beauty and ruin, and to capture sort of a stilled state of transition between the two. Does that make sense? And I was I was wrapping my head around what I wanted to do and what was happening here, but what I was doing was using materials that women use to decorate themselves or their spaces with, and I was partnering them with different destructive agents. And I still do that in all of my work. It's changed a lot, but that really is the relationship that I like to activate. So this piece is 5 by 5 feet. It's called Ripe Earth. And this was me asking myself what happens when a woman merges with the earth. And it was exciting for me to think about a character merging with her landscape, and that's also something that I've carried with me into my current work. And this was also one of the larger pieces in the first show I had of these textile paintings in 2011 in Chelsea. And I was really, really excited about this show and really proud of this work, because I felt in my core, and I still know it in my core, that I was making the work of my life. And it will change, in 10 years. I hope when I get to come back here, I'm sure it will look very different. But I knew I was doing what I was supposed to do. And I had just the highest hopes for this show, and it fell so flat. And I'm not the first artist in the world, and it's happening now that, it's like, you have such high hopes, and no one bought anything. I mean, no one bought anything, no one wrote anything. I did an artist talk, not one person showed up. I put every single piece back into a U-Haul and like cried the whole way back to my studio in Brooklyn. I'm thinking like, this is the end. I don't know how I'm gonna make this work, but I believe in the work so much. Then I got dropped by the gallery, and it's like, how many punches, can you take? But you dust yourself off and you keep going if you believe this is what you're supposed to do. And this piece actually lives in the Tennessee State Museum in somebody's office. I mean, you can go poke around and see it, but there is a woman who works right in front of it every day. I went to go visit it when I moved here. Okay, so Ophelia by Millay, 1852. So I've had this painting, a picture, a postcard really, of this painting in my studio ever since I was in college. And like Rosie Pascal, my high school art teacher, I had another amazing professor in college, Peter Haas, who reiterated that your subject matter is right under your nose, and that your interests are all relevant, and you need to pursue them and see where it takes you. So in thinking about this piece, after having made Ripe Earth, I love how she was in between worlds. She is literally about to sink into her environment and merge with it. And also it's a very storied landscape. So all of these elements really attract me to this painting and inspired me to make a three-part series about the afterlife of Ophelia. I'm not pretending to be a Shakespeare scholar, although I certainly have read Hamlet. But my goal in doing this was that I wanted to give her another existence and sort of not give Hamlet the last laugh here, but to give her an afterlife that has 3 chapters and can go on for infinities, as far as I'm concerned. But I want to tell you the titles of these, then we can talk a bit more about them. But this is called A Rather Violent Merger of a Wedding Dress and a Swamp. So inspired very much by Millay's painting, thinking about her merging with her environment, and that there's some acceptance, there's some resistance, but there's sort of a fury of these two elements coming together. And then the second piece here, Primrose Path, Engulfed in Smoke. So Primrose Path is from Hamlet, but here they're sort of right in between, half and half. She's started to leave this world and become part of this swampy environment that was once the place of her death, and it's now the place of her rebirth. But that environment has started to spark and become engulfed in smoke. And then this one is an underwater encounter with a burning tree. So she has now taken on this afterlife as an underwater creature and has this very impossible, but not in my mind impossible, encounter with an underwater encounter with a burning tree. So let's see, this was 2011, 2012, and these are in the Wild Woman room of Tempest. And what's really exciting for me, in addition to having this show, is that this is the first time all 3 have been shown together. So it's the first time I've actually seen them hung in a beautiful place outside of my studio, and they don't live in the same place, so it's really nice to have them here. Okay. When I was living in Brooklyn, I taught at Pratt Institute for 10 years, which was, I love living in Nashville, but I really do miss teaching at Pratt. I taught a wonderful class called Light, Color, and Design. It was a year-long class, and we explored lots of different media, and like my work, we explored the sort of transformative possibilities of those materials, but we also did representational painting and an abstract painting too. But we studied the Impressionists, and we talked about light hunters and chasing light, and what visual information can you document from a specific time of day, at a specific place, at a specific season. And I still have a healthy jealousy of students when I get to work with them, and what they were learning and what they were experiencing and the work they were making and sort of the accidents they were making too. Yeah, I just have a healthy jealousy of it. It ultimately will filter its way back into my studio. So sort of partnering Monet with Joan Mitchell, an abstract expressionist painting and a great hero of mine, I just wanted to dig a bit deeper into what I could do with the brush marks and the fabric. And I made my next body of work dealing with Eve and thinking about not her afterlife so much, but really the afterlife of Eden. So what happens when the decision of a woman starts to destroy a perfect place? So these are two out of many works in this body of work, but this one is here at the Frist. This one isn't. But they're about specific times of day in Eden post-apple, right? So this is daybreak, the day after the apple, and this is the swamp at dusk. So sort of pulling from the Ophelia experience, then bringing in what I was working with my students, thinking about specific times of day and wanting to sort of further translate these textiles into paintings. When I was making these works, I was very, very lucky to be the artist in residence at Materials for the Arts in Queens. And has anybody heard of it by any chance? It's a wonderful organization. They occupy a huge warehouse floor in Queens, New York, and they accept donations from private individuals to huge companies to shows on Broadway, and they will just take in miscellany and give it back to the community through their art teachers and through people doing public works. And I don't think they would have much left if they let artists come in unless they're doing a public work, but thankfully they do have this residency program that I got to take advantage of. When I was their artist in residence, I had only been working on canvas, and I'd been sewing all of these marks and textiles and flowers onto the canvas. And I had to work within the mission of the organization, and it was also time for me to put on a more sustainable hat in my process. So, and I couldn't really wait around during my residency for some museum quality canvases to be donated because this really wasn't a guarantee, although you'd be surprised about all the things that come in there. But I changed the way I worked and I changed the foundation, so I started to make them by really making very simple weavings. So this is me in my studio making these really long ropes, AKA friendship bracelets. I mean, this is really low tech. I would just go through the pounds and pounds of discarded trimmings or fabric that wasn't the right color or the right stitch count or whatever from different fashion houses, and I would make these long ropes, I mean, really with a friendship knot technique. And then I would weave all of the ropes together into one large, it's like a pot holder, really. But they're about 6 by 8 feet, and they're really heavy. And that became an interesting moment in the work where carrying these and moving these, I had like a bodily relationship with them because they also weren't rigid, you know, they were quite soft. So I'm under there somewhere. So when I was making the work about Eve for my show Past Perfection in 2013, I also did a collaboration with 2 former students of mine from Pratt, Anna Niedermeyer and Jillian McManaman. I want to make sure I got that right. And we were exploring what happens when women merge with their landscape, and we had a much larger group of collaborators actually, where someone was writing stories about heartbreak and how to merge those stories with different environmental conditions. And so we made a video called Succumbing to Storm, and this is a still from the video from Frost skirt. And so Anna and I collaborated to make these storm skirts for the video. But I wanted to show this because it was great to sort of work 3D again after going back to the paintings, but also that collaborating is so important because you have to leave your comfort zone, you know, in order to grow. And it's great to work with people who have different skills than you and different perceptions and different abilities. So it was a great experience. This is a really bad picture, but it was not a mistake to put it in. This is from 2013, 2014. And this is right before I moved from New York to Nashville. I was still thinking about storms and how to depict women becoming, really how to depict the weather becoming a feminine force. And I just want to show you these so you can get a better understanding for the process that I'm still using now. So this is back on a canvas that I still had before the Materials for the Arts residency that I obviously wanted to use. I put an underpainting on it, and then I cut up different scraps, and I would hand dye them and then pin them into place, all these little pins. And then I sew all those pieces on, and then I add more and more layers, and then this is the finished piece. So this is Precipitation, which is also in the Wild Woman room of the Frist Center. So I finished this piece when I got to Nashville, but I started it in New York. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I didn't move to Nashville because I thought it'd be so great for my art career. I mean, I moved to Nashville for a lot of good reasons, but that really wasn't on the forefront of my mind. And I was so wrong, and I'm so glad to be wrong about it. But I think these works really exemplify that, although there are many reasons. I was paying for a tiny windowless studio in Brooklyn where I couldn't even fit my work in the end, especially after the show where I had to bring everything in from the U-Haul. But I was wanting to make these storm systems, and I didn't have a window, and I couldn't really see any. And I was watching storm systems on YouTube in a studio in Brooklyn, and it just was sort of a bad look, and the works, I couldn't figure them out. And then when I moved to Nashville, I moved into a space that was free because it was at my family's home in Gallatin, and I got to watch the storms come in. I mean, I actually had a relationship with this landscape, and I got to see what these storm systems look like and resolve these pieces. So I made the storm systems, and in between each body of work, you're making some transitional works, which you never know how those are going to go. But in that time of transition, I was taking a lot of walks, and I would bring a little kit with me sometimes of ribbon and who knows what. And this property that I was living in is my grandmother's house, and it was the first place I went to when I came back from the hospital as a baby. So I have a lifelong relationship with this place. And something that's really special about the landscape there is that my mother she's an arborist, and she's very fabulous, but she really tends to the trees. And one of the things she does to take care of the trees and take care of the property is she creates these beautiful, accidentally beautiful burn piles where she's gathering sticks that have fallen from storms or washed up from the lake. And she doesn't lift things that heavy, to be honest, but she has help. But the landscape is just sprinkled with these wild, hive-like, sort of magnificent yet wicked burn piles. And I would visit them in different stages. I wouldn't go in them if they were on fire, but this is obviously after the fire where there were some large pieces that didn't burn. And I started to heal them or wrap them. And again, this was a transitional moment. I wasn't really sure how it was going to inform the work, but it certainly did. And just to I was also looking a lot at Gaetano Pesce's vessels. He's an Italian artist, but these are all made out of resin. And shortly after we moved back, I became pregnant with our second son, who was probably our last child, but I was thinking about myself as a vessel and thinking about myself in this storied landscape that I came from. And this picture is by Andrea Barron's For Native magazine, but it's me standing on one of the burn piles that my mother partially made, but certainly orchestrated, sort of in the landscape of where I came, of my birth or of my home. And at this time, it was the first time I ever used myself as the subject matter and used my own rite of passage as the subject matter. And in doing that, I made a body of work called Bells and Burn Piles, and that's the mother room of the Frist Center. So with Bells and Burn Piles, I wanted to tell the story of a bell or a womb merging, but also in conversation with a burn pile, and partner that with my own process of pregnancy and birth. So the body of work is larger than we could fit in this space, but I just want to sort of actually maybe just back up a second by saying, the word bell, why did I use the word bell? A bell became a more interesting word for me, but I'm using it interchangeably with vessel or with womb, and I think ultimately becomes a head too. But a bell is a vessel, and a bell is in a womb-like shape. But what's really interesting and beautiful about a bell is it has the potential to make sound even in silence. That you can look at a bell and you can hear it even when it's not being rung. And I think that's a really beautiful way and a very legitimate way to think about a womb as well. That whenever you consider a womb, it will forever be associated with the potential to create life or to create energy, even when it's dormant. But Belle gave me the opportunity to give the work a bit of a longer life compared to just a womb, because when I was making the work, just the wall pieces, after the bell met the fire, sort of, and this birth happened, it didn't seem like the story was over. It felt like I needed to keep going. And that's when the bell became the heads of my sons. And that story begins on the floor. But let me show you a couple of these images so I can explain it a bit better. Okay, so this is full vessel, which is here. And so this is sort of in its like heightened potential. This is definitely 80, I'd say maybe 90% bell or womb, 10% burn pile as it starts to disintegrate a little bit. This one is called fruit-bearing smoke tree, and that's one that's right in between, about 50-50 bell and burn pile. And then this is burn pile, 90% burn pile, maybe 10% bell. But so like I was saying, it wasn't over. The story didn't seem like it was going to be over. And the reason why I was interested in partnering my own rite of passage with fire is that I was still putting these decorative materials with these destructive agents, just like what I was doing with the cake. But what was really dynamic about fire is that it doesn't have to be just a destructive agent, that fire is a natural process to actually create space for new life. And it has a lot of, possibilities for to regenerate new life and for things to be created. So after this burn pile, hold on. Okay, I made these works. I forgot I put this in at the last minute. I also make a lot of collages while I work, and this is green ash bed, so and starting to get to after the fire, but thinking about when the ash really starts to regenerate and become part of life on Earth. And then here, the black bell is starting to create sound again. So really, what happens after the fire? Okay, and then these are the large works, right? So we've created space for new life. And with these floor pieces, I'd walk around and I'd gather charred sticks or burnt nuggets from the burn piles after they had met the ground. And I just love the idea of these huge hive-like piles of sticks just burning down and then having a very small, close relationship with the earth. And so I made 3 of these. They're all about 54 inches in diameter from burnt sticks from our property. Some of them I wrapped, and some of them I didn't. But this is the first one, Remains. And Remains looks very much like what you find when when the bonfire is over and it meets the ground. And then in Artifacts, the charred sticks start to become specimens. They start to separate and take on more interesting shapes, start to have their own identity. And then in Pairs, I'm going to back up here. And then in Pairs, the third one, those artifacts start to pair together and find relationships with each other, ways that they're different, ways that they're similar, very much as my 2 sons are doing as they sort of grow and go out into the world. So this sort of resolves the bells and the burn pile body of work and the mother room. And this slide, certainly different from any of the other ones, is the group of artists who all participated in Metro Arts Learning Lab. We started in summer 2016. I didn't see this coming, but another great reason to live in Nashville. There's so many good opportunities for artists. Metro Lab, the Learning Lab program, I hope I explained this well, but the big picture of the program was to bring artists together to teach them how to sort of levitate their skills from their actual practice. So I didn't really know what many people's work even looked like. And when a bunch of artists get together, that is a very unusual thing to say, to not even know we didn't compare websites, we didn't do any slideshows, no one was showing pictures on their phone. But they taught us how to levitate our skills from our work and think about just the skills that we use to make our work and how to apply them to our community to change the way our city lives. I mean, wow, it was super big picture and really exciting and very, very moving. The goal of the program was to help artists learn how they can work civically. And I don't think, personally, I've gotten there yet. I think we have to move our practice in sensible steps. I think now I'm working a bit more socially. But this program was a game changer for me in a lot of ways, but it also helped me to envision the show and figure out what I was going to do with this wonderful opportunity and how Tempest was really going to work out. We had titled the show Tempest pretty early on, and it was spot on. I just didn't know how the rooms were going to go. And the reason why the show is called Tempest is that a tempest is a disturbance. And that really applies to all three rooms. So in each of the room, there is a different character or a different chapter that I explore that could be a chapter in any woman's life. And I partner each chapter with a different adjutant or disturbance. So in the first room, you have the wild woman meets the storm, and we looked at a lot of that work. And then the second room is the mother meets the burn pile. And then in the third room, it's the elder meets silence. And I really had the vision for the show while in the program, but it was the elder project that came out of my learning lab experience. So while I was in the learning lab and living in Nashville, I mentioned I was living in my grandmother's home in Gallatin, and my grandmother is still alive. And I thought we would be living with her when we moved, but she had a stroke about 2 weeks before we moved to from New York. And she lives in a nursing home 15 minutes from the house. So visiting her, 2 or 3 times a week, my mom and I are there every other day. Somebody is there visiting her. And so that was very much part of my life that I wasn't thinking about in relation to my work. But when I started talking with these artists and learning from the learning lab, I realized how relevant it was, that everything is relevant, but that I needed to bring it into my studio and then I needed to adapt it to my work and make it sort of complete the Tempest show. So when I was going to visit my grandmother, and this is still the case, she's 93, and she's in a very natural, she has a naturally evolving relationship with silence right now. It's sort of the best way I know how to put it. And it's a very normal thing for her to be losing her interest and ability in communicating, and it's also a very sad and frustrating thing when you want someone to be talking to you and telling you everything they know and sharing stories to make sure that you have it right. So that was something I was dealing with on a very consistent basis, and the Learning Lab helped me to widen my scope and think outside of my family and to think outside of my grandmother's room. I'm named after her, by the way. She's also Vadis. So I started to go there and think about and walk by a lot of other men and women who have different relationships with silence and think about what their family's relationship is like with this. And with silence, I don't mean death. I'm talking about communication and wisdoms and the potential loss of wisdoms. And that it's a two-way street. It might not be someone's inability to communicate, but also men and women who aren't being asked questions at all. So given that and given this program, I decided to make my next body of work based on interviews with female elders, starting with my grandmother's community. And I've never based work on interviews before. I didn't have an agenda or a goal, really, but I met with a lot of very generous, fabulous older women, and sometimes their family members. And we started the conversation by talking about, what is it that you've learned from other generations of women in your life that you value and sort of deem worthy of wanting to pass on? And when I could meet with their family members, I could learn from them what are some things that they intended to pass on or things they didn't intend to pass on that you also deem valuable and worthy of passing on. And the conversation started like that. And they were just immediate, every conversation, we just got to the heart of it within, 40 seconds. We didn't chew any fat, and many times we were crying within a couple minutes together because we were talking about what matters, the essence of someone and what it is that sort of what's the fiber or the glue of your family that is specific to your family. So it was an incredibly moving project, and I just want to show this one picture. I met with about 22 women or families. This one is Sally Wells. The project sort of spread in a very organic way. I actually don't remember right now how I connected with Sally, but she's an active member of the Choctaw tribe in Nashville, and she feels that her heirloom and her family is the Choctaw Reservation in Mississippi. So it's a place where she doesn't even live, but it's something that's been passed on in her family, and that's where her people go. And, having conversations like this just blew my mind, because without agenda, they were teaching me how to sort of reimagine what an heirloom is, and to reconsider an heirloom as a place, potentially, or as a ritual, or as a spirit. And so in these conversations, I just started to learn that, an heirloom doesn't have to be an object of value that is something physical that we can hold, that what connects people could just be how they spend their time. So Sally Wells is present in a couple of the heirloom pieces. And then, let's see, this is Lorraine Brearley and her daughter Sue. And she is also in one of the place-based pieces. The heirloom in their family is Lake Michigan. I mean, these are all women living in Tennessee, but Lake Michigan is where their people go. And so again, it's not even something that you own, but that families have sort of a gravitational pull to some places. So I want to talk about these 2 interviews I did, and I did so many, but when I went back to listen to them all, trying to figure out what to do with them, I started to learn that these heirlooms, they could be wisdoms, but they were really, I sort of use heirloom and wisdom interchangeably in this body of work. But I found 4 categories that the wisdoms fit into. So there are place-based heirlooms, like the ones these families fit into, ritual-based heirlooms, spirit-based heirlooms, and object-based heirlooms. And so those are the works that take up most of the elder room at the Frist Center. So this is Place Heirloom 1, Sunrises and Lakes. And this is, so this is the piece that embodies the 2 women that I showed you. So this is about Lake Michigan, this is about a reservation in Mississippi, and this is also about my grandmother's home. And like I said, I had never worked this way before, and I didn't really know how to do this. When you're an abstract painter working in textiles made out of domestic materials, how do you translate all of these stories and bring them in together into one composition? And it was an incredibly challenging and powerful experience, and the compositions are all a little bit different. But what started to happen with this work and some of the other works is they started to swell out from the wall. And it's hard to see in this picture, but these swells became a really important part of the heirloom project. And that shape really came from the mother room and that sort of womb bell hive-like shape. This is Spirit Heirloom, Moonlight on a Shimmering Rock. Also, this swell comes out from the wall a bit. The foundation in these works was different also than the ones in the previous work. So I've done canvas, acrylic sheets for the mother pieces, and the woven pieces for the Eve series. But here I went back to quilts. So quilts are a very traditional heirloom in America, and I went back to buying more cutter quilts. This time I was tie-dyeing them and sewing them together and trying to leave parts that were exposed, right, under the ribbon painting. And with this spirit-based piece, I interviewed a lot of women that where their religion was really their heirloom. And I interviewed one Holocaust survivor whose life took her from Vienna to Shanghai to San Francisco, and now her son is a rabbi in Nashville, and that's why she lives here. But that is really the most important heirloom that they have in their family. And these stories were magnificent, but how do you tie them all together? So what I want to say about this one is that I thought a lot about how painters have dealt with depicting religion and sort of sacred, miraculous moments, and using light has been a pretty consistent way to talk about spirituality and religion. And in this work, I thought, okay, I've got to work with something invisible, but I want to turn it inside out and actually turn spirituality into a rock, something that's foundational, but is very present and very heavy. But something as heavy and present and dominant in a landscape as a large boulder or rock can disappear when you turn off the lights. So to sort of merge the rock and the lighting as a way to address all of these beautiful stories about spirituality was my goal here. And then this is, again, the yellow and green is really off in this photograph, but this is object heirloom. Object heirloom, this is a sewing box and a recipe box as gardens. So here I wanted to turn the physical objects, which were heirlooms in a family, into these growing wall gardens. And this whole quilt is exposed. The scraps on this were inspired by a hat scrap quilt of one elder I interviewed whose great-grandmother was a milliner and would make scraps from the negative spaces of hats. So I took scraps from my studio floor and sewed them on to the quilt. But here this was a variation from the other pieces where I got an old wooden shadow box, and so there were some hard found elements in these pieces, and that became the sewing box and the recipe box. This is one of the ritual-based pieces that is not here in the show. We couldn't fit them all in, so I thought this was a good chance to show them. This is called Champion Roses and Burnt Logs. Something that was so interesting in these interviews was, the rituals that a lot of these women had all related, not all of them, but many of them related to the earth. And I loved thinking about all of these different pastimes, like raising champion roses and like my mom tending to the earth. But then I also thought about how these pastimes are not being passed on really as heirlooms, and what are we doing with our time, and what rituals are we embracing now in this time of sort of fast technology. But also these are pretty sculptural too. These are large burnt, sort of charred logs from the burn piles at our house. And this is another one that is in the show. Again, I'm sorry the color's a little off, but this is Place Heirloom 2. So I set out just to make 4 of these, but I couldn't really stop. So this is Place Heirloom 2, Kitchen Table as Landscape. And that a place doesn't have to be a house, or it doesn't have to be Lake Michigan, but it could also be just a kitchen table or a dining room table. And thinking about the landscape that certain women that I met with, the efforts that they made to create this place where people came together to share their time. I met with one family whose mother, this was a great line that's part of the title, it's called Birds Can't Fly Upside Down, but they were trying to help her by setting the table, and she looked at the plates and she was like, "What? You guys are not helping me. Birds can't fly upside down." And that all of their lives, the plates had been perfectly oriented so that all the birds were flying the right way in the sky and all of the flowers were growing up from the right orientation in the table as a landscape. And so this is also a swell that's coming out. But when I look at these, the storm is still happening in these from previous bodies of work, and I certainly feel that here. Okay, so this is the last slide from the show that's here, the Siren Swing. So this was one of the last pieces I made for this show, and it was a result of all of these interviews that I did with women who were, strangers to me before we sat down together. And after hearing all of their stories and learning about all of their heirlooms and the way that their family is connected, I felt so connected to them, and yet I had no connection to them at all. And I started to think about, what is the bigger picture here of how I am connected, if I am connected. And I started to consider that maybe, I don't know if I can call it the greatest heirloom of all, but the most common heirloom of all might be the physical cycle, really, that defines women as women. And I wanted to make a piece that captured sort of the beauty and, again, maybe the fury of that cycle. And so I asked over 20 women to collect sweat and tears while they were ovulating and give me samples of these ovulation waters. And so I got the 20 plus samples, and I'm not going to name their names, but there are some of my Siren sisters in this room here tonight. But I mixed these ovulation waters with resin and created the base of the Siren Swing. And what's important about the piece being in the elder room is that I want to connect the elder and the wild woman and the mother. And that system, if we're related or not, is something that we all share and something that is part of almost every rite of passage. But I also love being reminded that, when a woman is pregnant with a daughter, that you're also carrying the eggs of the next generation. And that in that moment, that cycle enables you to connect all three, the elder, the mother, and the wild woman can all live together in that one place at that one time. So that really concludes the show, and I've been making a little bit of new work, so I just want to prove that I haven't totally been, drinking Mai Tais by the pool this summer. So coming off of the Elder series, I started to make these swells, and these are about 2 feet by 2 feet. And I had been tie-dyeing a lot of quilts that I still had around the studio. And I just really want to show you sort of where I am and what's going on right now. This isn't part of a body of work that I've totally wrapped my head around, but these are black swells. Obviously, now there's a shell of ribbon over the quilt. And I'm taking these, or the black ones, to Chicago with me, along with some of the works from the Elder Room on Monday. So that's really where the show leaves off and kind of takes off from there. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Are there any questions, or is it like 9:30? Close. Nope. Mm-hmm.
I just have a comment. So I love this whole thing, and I know you, but I don't know your work that well. You just sort of have these circles that circle around us, and this is so I think it's so relevant. At least it is for me right now. As I move into these different cycles of life, and I feel like I'm moving toward elder life. And the body is changing and everything is in transition. And I think that I can't express to you how important I think it is for this process to be shown and to have voice and to live in a way that's not diminished. Because I think that that's a challenge that we have as women as we get older, is that there's this feeling, societal feeling of diminishing. And I love that, that there's this fire and it still explores who we are and doesn't leave off.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, as a fellow woman, or not a fellow woman, that sounds weird, right? That it's just is so beautiful and so relevant. I wrote some stuff on my, I was I don't have a piece of paper. It's just, I love it.
Thank you, and I agree. I absolutely agree. It is so important that it isn't diminished. Yeah.
I'd like to know, do you write?
I do. I mean, I can't say. I can't say I write all that well all the time, but you do have to wear so many hats as an artist, and I'm the one writing about the work too. But part of the process is I give myself permission to make a lot of bad drawings and bad writing to help me suss out ideas and sort of see what the connections are. But yes, writing is definitely part of the process.
Along those veins, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how you title your works? Because they often are quite poetic.
Oh, thank you. I enjoy titles. I think at the end of the day, at the end of making the work, I just sort of know what to do sometimes. And that's not always the case. I mean, some of the pieces, they want to be made, and sometimes the title isn't that hard for me to come up with, but there's some that have been bossing you around for so long. I mean, you don't even know what to do with them. But that's a really tough one for me. I just feel like when I finish the piece, I know what it's supposed to be called. And I also want to give the work another moment that, and if you're experiencing it and you can interpret it however you want, that maybe the title might connect you to my objectives a little bit more, which that isn't how I judge the success of the piece, if how you're seeing it connects to my objectives, but I hope that it will give some insight as to what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself sometime in future becoming one of the activist artists? I think that's the word for them. Since you're working with the theme of feminine.
Yeah, we'll see, I guess is the answer. We'll see. I mean, I've just started to engage with collecting subject matter through interviews, and I'm not sure yet. I'm certainly not opposed to it. We'll just see where the work goes. Well, thank you for being here. I'm sorry I went over all good things. Thank you again to Katie and to Mark and to the Frist Center and everybody I've worked with. This has been a huge pleasure. So have a good night.